So what I thought I'd do today, and the idea of the webinar, is to try and share some of the thoughts and experience I've gained over the 25 years of either the commercial or the military world as to how a crisis management situation feels and some of the principles behind trying to solve it. The webinar was set up deliberately to help people who have little or no knowledge of crisis management. And so I'm conscious that actually there's a lot of people on this webinar today. There's over 170 people. And therefore, I don't know everybody. I don't know who might be on there and whether they're at a high level within their organization or a low level, whether they've got lots of experience or not. So we're going to keep the content of today's webinar fairly basic. And we're not going to go into a lot of depth in any of the 5 principles. We're going to kind of skim across the top of it. And the idea is that obviously if you have further questions or thoughts you want to ask me, then please by all means do so. Either through the question and answer button that you have on your webinar screen, or certainly as follow-ups, because if 170 people ask a question, I'm not going to possibly be able to answer all of them during the hour that we've got. So by all means ask questions as we go through. The webinar is also being recorded, and therefore there'll be a recording released to you at the end of this. You should get a link back to yourselves. But if you don't get a link for whatever reason, then there will be a follow-up email from ourselves with a link to the recording. And that email from ourselves will also have in all the references that I go through today. So any articles that I talk about, any books that I talk about, or individuals that I talk about, those will all be included as references for you to be able to look up. So let's get stuck into the meat of what we're looking at today, which is a crisis management situation. And essentially, what is the problem? Well, the problem essentially with any crisis management situation is that emotion kicks in. So as soon as we are in a situation whereby either real bullets are flying or verbal bullets are flying, then we start to kick straight into that fight or flight response. And the inner chimp starts to kick into us. So we feel the need to do something, to act, to respond. Whether that is to actually get away, to hide, just think this is all really miserable and horrible and we can't cope, or whether it's to take it full on, to get stuck into it and to try and do the best thing that we can. That situation and that emotion, believe it or not, is also highly addictive, because for some of us, like using our system 1 brain. We like using that instinctive, reactive, get in there and do something brain. So we actually enjoy a sense of crisis. We enjoy having to do something. We enjoy having to act, and we want it to carry on. So we rush into things headlong, not knowing whether we're actually heading for the edge of a cliff or not. For other people, it's equally addictive in the fact that they are morose and upset by it, and they actually kind of enjoy wallowing in it. So we want to try and deal with these emotions that we're facing across not just ourselves, but all of our team as well. And we need to be very careful in both of those circumstances around confirmation bias, i.e., just looking for things that ratify what we already believe and want to believe ourselves. So what we'll tend to do if we're not careful is only look for indicators that confirm what we already suspect, what we already want to know. We don't necessarily look for indicators that debunk that and challenge that, okay? So it's really important that we get into this side of things, and Daniel Kahneman's book is really powerful on that side of things, the system 1 and system 2 thinking. The system 2 thinking is where we are rational, logical, analytical, and taking our time to think things through. The system 1 thinking is the instinctive one. And what tends to happen when we're in a crisis management situation is that we automatically default to system 1. Now, that's okay, because some things have to be decided quite quickly. But equally, some things we can afford to slow down, okay? Because panic is infectious, yes, but so is calmness. And so whether we are a leader or whether we are just a member of a team, we can have an equal impact on the team and the people around us by being calm. So we need to think about the effect that we're having on our team at this point in time. We need to think at this point about being compassionate. We need to think about being caring. It sounds really counterintuitive, but in a crisis management situation, we almost need to be taking more time to listen to people and to genuinely listen to people and to hear what they are saying, not just listening while we wait our turn to respond. So understanding where people are coming from, because if we don't understand within our team who is wanting to fire off and do that instinctive gut reaction and who is really concerned, we don't know how to communicate with them effectively. So we need to work on that and need to be very careful around that ability of the team. The second thing that we need to think about within this area is purpose, okay? If we've got into a crisis management situation, and if we're into the situation we're now facing, let's say with coronavirus, with people locked down, people will be going to work or will have wanted to go to work, whether they've actually believed it or not, whether they actually like their job or not, it still gives them a sense of purpose. It's something that they get up and they do every day, okay? So as soon as you take that away from them, even if they're sat at home now with their 80% salary backed by the government, if they're lucky enough to be in that situation, or whatever situation they happen to be in, they've now lost that sense of purpose. They've lost that sense of doing something and being productive and helpful. So we all need to think of ways in which we can regenerate that sense of purpose. And there's lots of different hints and tips. I was talking to somebody earlier this week before the lockdown actually came in the UK. And they were lamenting the fact that their people that work for them couldn't do their day-to-day job because he ran these party boats, disco boats on the river in the Thames in the middle of London. And the boats weren't being used. Nobody was coming along to them. And so his team were feeling a bit at a loss. He still had enough money in the business to pay them. Salary wasn't particularly too much of an issue, but the people were feeling lost. So we discussed it backwards and forwards, and we came up with the idea that, well, actually, he had vans. He had lots of vans to deliver all the goods that he needed to the boats. So why not get people volunteering to go and help do deliveries to the vulnerable, to the aged, to people who needed it, to food banks? And that generated a massive sense of purpose again for those individuals and was really positive. Now, obviously not all those things are now feasible when we're in lockdown, but equally we can find purpose in different ways. There's nothing to stop you getting in touch with or reaching out to a local residential home that's caring for elderly or vulnerable people, asking them if you can set up some sort of FaceTime relationship with one of the individuals in there, start talking to them, start talking to each other, have that sense of purpose, get that community around this. That helps with the morale of the team. The final bit we want to think about in this keeping calm piece is about what you can control and what you can't control, okay? It's a bit like the picture there of the warship, all right, in a stormy sea. Within the ship, the captain and the crew can only control what happens inside the ship, its mechanics and how it is going about and how it is being operated, and themselves. They cannot control what is happening outside in the storm and the sea and the waves. So actually, worrying about the storm and the sea and the waves isn't going to help you. You should be focusing on what you can control. And that will really help you then focus on what you need to do. And we'll come on to that in a little bit. So I'm going to skip across now some of these areas we call the 7 disciplines. Right? This is what we work with and I work with when I'm working with my clients. And this is what business performance or organizational performance is based on. In essence, at the moment in a crisis management situation, lots of people will be feeling stressed. Okay, so they need to try and manage that stress as best they can. For some people, it's a positive stress because they enjoy this type of situation. Others, it's a very negative and very damaging, very harmful stress. Through that worry and anxiety, they will be getting more and more fatigued. Okay, that will cause them to not necessarily gain as much situational awareness as they could do, because they'll be trying to analyze everything or not analyzing enough. That impacts on their decision making. It impacts on their leadership, because now they're making poor decisions. So they start to communicate differently. Because they start to communicate differently, it affects the team. So this framework is all entirely interrelated. And this is what we at Quirk Solutions basically work on, is all of these different factors within an organization and helping people to get set up with these. But everything I'm going to talk about over the next 50 minutes or so will be based on these 7 disciplines. But if we talk about that, we'll be talking about it for a long, long time. So I'm going to talk first of all about these 5 principles behind crisis management. We'll start off with keeping it simple. I'll talk for a little bit about keeping it simple, and then we'll take any questions you may have at this stage, okay? So by all means, send those questions through. So in terms of keeping it simple then, it's all about a focus. Think about the time span that you are now operating on. Don't start to worry about your business plan or your organizational plan that you may be having or trying to develop and that you've had for maybe the next 2 years, and how the situation now is going to affect you over this coming 2 years. All right. I am very conscious at the moment within my own business that cash flow is being impacted upon by the situation. And so therefore things are being pushed off to the right. Now, if I allow myself to dwell on that, if I allow myself to worry about where that is squeezing the tube of toothpaste and the effect it's going to have not just in the next 6 months, but in the next year, then I'm not focused on what I need to focus on, which is right now and getting through this next 3 months to 6 months. So the first thing I need to do is I need to focus on the timeline that I want to look at. And that for me is literally either week by week or month by month to work out what I need to do. When do I need to take actions? The next thing we need to think about is the data and the analysis, and hence the image that's in the center there. The image in the center I put down because of the influence of a very good friend of mine, Graham Hogg, who works and is a director within a company called Paton, and he's based out in New York at the moment. And Graham's mantra is ask better questions. The issue we have when we're faced with uncertainty, when we're faced with a crisis management situation, is that all too often, all of us will be looking for as much data as we can, as much as we can possibly lay our hands on to analyze it and to bring it through. That just leads to us being swamped, and not all of it is helpful, and some of it is contradictory, and it's going to confuse us. So actually we should think about Graham's mantra of ask better questions. So you should list out the questions that you need answered right now. Things like, when do I need to make my next decision? What does that decision have to be? And then you start to look for the data that will help you make those decisions, and only those decisions, nothing else. Don't get distracted by shiny things all over the place, all these interesting little articles popping up here, there, and everywhere. Focus on the data that helps you answer your questions that you have right now. It might be that because you've got no planning experience whatsoever, the question is, how do I generate a plan? So start to go and look for things that help you form a plan. Don't go off getting distracted. The final piece of this focus session is all about slowing down to speed up. okay? We mentioned at the start that we will have this instinctive brain kicking in and the analytical brain not wanting to kick in. But we need to be able to use both, and we need to be able to work out which bits sit where. Inevitably, in a crisis, there are going to be some decisions that have to be made right now, okay? So you are going to use your fast side of your brain for those. How do I, as the bullets start flying in from some sort of ambush, find somewhere immediately that gets me out of the bullets and sheltered behind this piece of earth somewhere? Then, though, we need to drop that system one thinking and kick into the system two thinking of, right, what needs to happen next? And I need to slow myself down. I need to take that pause. I need to breathe. I need to try and detach myself from the situation so that I can think clearly and rationally. So trying to work out which things you need to do now and which things you can afford to think about is really important. Okay, so we're going to take a brief pause now to have a look at any of the questions that have come in. So I've got one in from Philippa. How can we help with the mental health of our teams when you're up against the global hysteria? Yeah, it's a really good question, to be honest, because we are all herd animals, whether we like it or not. Over millennia, we learned to be part of a group. If you were external to the group, you got eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. That's basically what happened. So none of us want to be outside of the group. And therefore, we are influenced as a group. Hence the reason why we've seen panic buying and things like that. It's because people are drawn by the rest of the group. And it takes really strong leadership to actually change that. And I'm not just talking about leadership from people in senior positions. I'm talking about your own internal self-leadership. In a crisis situation, this is the point at which all of us essentially have to stand up to the plate. We have to stand up and be counted. And whether that is us leading our teams or whether that's us leading ourselves, and that's self-leadership, that is the most important thing here. It's looking at things like that global hysteria and saying, does this really count? Is this really important? I think the other thing that kicks in is I've got a good friend who is the CEO of Brother UK called Phil Jones, and Phil has often mentored and guided me along the way of my commercial career. And Phil talks about evidence over emotion. So I think, again, mental health of the teams can be really helped by that evidence, because the evidence starts to trump the emotion. But you've got to present it in a way that people feel they can take it on board. So you've got to try and break them out of what they're concerned about right now. So things like regular contact, setting up group meetings on Zoom or Teams or whatever else it is, so that you are regularly in touch with people. Don't allow people, your people within your teams, to fester and to dwell on things. Help them be in a regular contact and feel like they can share those problems. That's probably the answer to that, Philippa, and I hope that's helped. Okay, let's move on to the next piece, which is all about communicating. Okay, so communicating. There's some key principles here, okay, and also a bit that I'm going to try and explain to you using my two wonderful children. So there's some principles that you'd obviously all understand around accuracy, brevity, and clarity. When you are in a fast-moving and very fluid, very dynamic situation, this is not the time for long, drawn-out soliloquies, okay? We do want to be as precise as we possibly can. However, a useful way of thinking about this and about making sure our communication is not just issued, but is understood, is the Tiggy test. Okay, Tiggy is my daughter. who you can see down to the left-hand side of the screen there, who works in agriculture. Now, when we start to try and communicate, particularly in a business environment, I have noticed that people tend to communicate in a way that makes sense to themselves. So almost like they're listening to their own little echo chamber. So they are using words that make sense to them. They're writing down things or producing slides that make sense to them. They're not thinking about the audience enough. So when I am writing down anything that I'm going to be doing, I do it in a way that I would call my Tiggy test. If I could explain this to Tiggs, if I could take her through this, would she understand? Am I using words that help her understand it? Because if you don't do that, the risk is you get drawn off into managerial speak, which just sounds awful and it's jargon and it doesn't help. So if you're in quite a large organization, think about the people who are right at the very sharp end of delivery for you. Think about the language that they would use, the words that they would use. Think about what will resonate with them and produce your communication around that, not something that makes sense to you, because then they just won't get it, they won't understand it. The other thing I want you to have a think about, okay, is doing a Dan, who is my son. Dan is, how can I put it, a pretty robust individual, and he does not shy away from speaking his mind. I often get questions, particularly in this environment, and in lots of the work I've been doing of late, around, well, I don't want to talk to my team about the difficult realities we might be facing because I don't want to make them anxious or nervous. I don't want to make them worried. Okay, so I don't want to talk about any potential restructuring. I don't want to talk about the impact of the bottom line on the business. I don't want to talk about whether our club will still exist in the future or not, whether we can make it through this, because, you know, I don't want to, and you will feel that sense of leadership or teamwork where you want to try and shoulder all of that. You need to do a Dan. You need to just say it how it is. Because there's this fantastic article on strategic intent written by Hamill and Prahalad, where they came out with this phrase essentially, that the threat that is being faced is all people can focus on. So if you're not confronting it, if you're not lancing that boil, if you're not dealing with that situation, then in essence, that's all anybody is still thinking about. And whilst you're there talking now about all the wonderful things you're going to do and how you're going to change, it's all very positive. All people are hearing is blah, 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 because you haven't addressed the key concern. This is going to be painful. This is going to be difficult. It's going to be a challenge. You've got to confront that and have that real challenging conversation with individuals. Otherwise, they're still focused on where you are elsewhere. Okay, we're going to come on now to a communication technique that I want to introduce you to called intent. But in order to talk about intent, I'm going to actually jump out of the presentation a minute and use some chocolates to try and illustrate my point, okay? When we're producing some sort of plan or some sort of communication, we don't do the Tiggy test. We write down a whole bunch of management speak. And so we get our mission statement. We get our vision statement. Nobody really understands what the difference is between those two, but let's not get hooked on that right now. Then we've got our values. Then we've got our objectives. Then we've got our expected benefits. And all of these things we produce into this one wonderful document that, because I'm the author and because I understand it, I can hold in my hands absolutely no problem at all. Because I get it and I can see how this all connects. And even if I make it as an attractive as a bunch of chocolates in my hands and I throw it to you, there is no way in which you are going to catch every single one. There's no way in which you're going to be able to connect the dots in the way that I have connected it in my own head. So what we do is we use this concept called intent. Okay? It's a technique that the military used and use extensively. It's a way of aligning the organization and getting everybody pointing in the same direction. Think of it as a compass heading if you want. So it's a 100 word, and I mean 100 word, no more précis of all those things we just described. So there's a little bit of the objectives. There's a little bit of the style in which this might happen. Are we going to be high risk or low risk? There's a little bit of who might be involved. There's a little bit of what we won't do and what's out of scope to protect ourselves from doing that. Okay, and there's a little bit of the core activities. It just gets everybody onto the same page. It doesn't give them all of the granular detail to be able to understand everything, but it gets everybody thinking in the same way. Okay. If you are in a larger organization, you can have different intents at different levels of the organization. So if we're going in to take the Al-Faw Peninsula in Iraq and do the insertion there, then the general's intent may well be to take the Al-Faw Peninsula, but to do it in a very methodical, step-by-step manner. So we only move one force when another force is secure in an area it's designed to take. Bring that down 5 or 6 levels to somebody like me in charge of a bunch of people, a much smaller group of people. My approach, my intent might be to be very high risk, because I am taking the very first buildings and I'm part of the very first insertion. Now I'm just using that as an illustrative example, but you can see how it connects together. And everybody has a different intent that connects with the one above them. So a very powerful thing. Now, the one thing you'll be all asking me right now is, well, what does one look like? Okay, so this is what an intent actually looks like. Is this best in class? I wouldn't say so, but this isn't bad at all. Okay, so we start off straight away with the big headline target. And this came from a telecommunications company that I was working with. Okay, so we understand straight away what we're trying to achieve and by when. Boom, got it. And we've put a constraint on ourselves. We're going to be in profit all the time. All right, so we're not going to overextend ourselves. Right, got it. There's a check and a balance there already. Then we've got something about the style and the manner. We're going to really go for it. It won't be safe and steady, but massive risks will be discussed. Okay. Now, if you think about it, that's sitting bang square as a big tick for the Tiggy test. That is written already in a way in which somebody would read it and go, I'm getting this, I'm understanding this, I can see where we're going with it. Then there's a little bit more about what we won't do. There's going to be a piece around, let's get away from contracts. We want to help our clients feel they want to stay with us, not because they have to. So now we're bringing in the client, but not just the client, we're thinking about how the client feels. And that's really important. It's not what the client wants, it's how the client feels. Okay. We then got another piece around what we're not going to do. We're not going to go for really big clients, because if we get a really big client, if we lose them, it drops a huge hole in our cash flow. And then they've got a little piece around the key activities that we're going to do. Maintain steady growth in existing services. I see an awful lot of people when they're planning, particularly for launching new products or new services, get so attracted and so drawn in by the new shiny product that they forget about the existing products. And the existing clients get really fed up because they're being marginalized. So this organization is saying, no, we're not doing that. We're going to keep an eye on existing stuff as well as launch the new service, basically in order to be an amazing company. Okay. So that's all about the communication. Let's kick back in now and take a few more questions. James, how can each of us better manage the constant transition from me and mine, individual concerns, to us and ours, and the greater good? Yeah, James, for those that don't know, I do actually know James, and he is very cerebral and likes to ask me challenging questions like this, which keeps me on my toes. The piece here, I think, is around being very wary of lag, of a lag and a time lag on the situation you were in prior to that. So you're quite right. It is important at times to be thinking about me and mine. You know, in order for me to look after my family, in order for me to look after my business and the people that work within my business, actually, to start off with, I need to think about me. If I'm not fit enough, if I'm not healthy enough to be able to operate, then I'm going to damage the support I could give to my family or to the rest of my team and to my business. So I need to think about me. But once I've done that, once I've worked out what the plan is for myself, I need to be really careful as I move into the next stage of, right, now let's transition to thinking about us and ours, that I don't still have that lag in the back of my head about, yeah, but what about me? So you have to kind of have a discipline of an on-off switch, whatever that might be. I use it in terms of just thinking about a specific place. And this is where things like mindfulness and others come in. You know, other people use meditation. Some sort of break, some sort of air gap that you can have between those two, that you recognize as being an air gap. So I have a particular place that I know, that I think of, and I just stop and I close my eyes and I think of that place. I think of the smells and the sounds that are around me when I'm in that place, and it's a place that I really enjoy being in. And when I come out of that pause, I have had that air gap and that buffer from what I've previously been thinking about with me and mine into us and ours. And you can do the same going backwards the other way. And I hope that helps a little bit, James. Truthy, how would we change our leadership style and communication pattern to the team based on a situation? Yes, you know, you're quite right, Truthy. When we are in the proper sharp end of a crisis, when it's really breaking all around us, then we would expect to be quite pointed, quite directive, okay, with what we are saying to the team. And we would expect the team to be quite pointed and quite direct back. And we're into a situation where things are flying backwards and forwards. As that situation starts to ease off, in much the same way as I gave the answer just now to James about transitioning from me and mine to us and ours, you can suffer a bit of a lag if you're not careful. And some people suffer in different ways. So you'll see some people within the organization who, as the situation eases, are still very much in the now and very aggressive and pointed and directed. And that's really starting to affect other individuals who are much more in the, oh, I'm taking a deep breath, that was horrible, and now at least I can catch my breath. So your leadership style does need to change as the way you go about it. Maybe one tip I can offer you, Shruti, is that the military always uses a tool called the 1/3, 2/3 rule. So whatever amount of time you have in order to commit something to action, if you are the leader of that organization, then you only use 1/3 of the time to come up with your thinking, come up with your analysis, and give your direction. That allows 2/3 of the time to the individuals concerned to be able to come up with their answers and help themselves. Okay, so try and use that. It's a really useful tool, because even if you've only got 1 minute, then you've got the 20 seconds. If you've got 3 weeks, you've got the 1 week. But that helps you work out how pointed your leadership style has to be. Martin, quick question on managing the vulnerability of individual team members when they stop being effective in a crisis, and how do you protect them but still ensure team effectiveness is insulated from the plan? Okay, so this is a real tricky one, to be honest, because clearly some individuals will want to feel like they can blame some of those people. some individuals within a team will be feeling like they're now sharing an unhelpful amount of the burden because others are really struggling. And I think that there's no easy answer to this one, to be honest, Martin. And it's no easy answer around the team effectiveness, because you've just got to accept that those individuals are going to struggle, and you can't really turn around to them and simply say, right, bang, buckle up, let's get on with it, come on, because it just won't work. Equally, you can't really turn around to the individuals that are feeling a bit fed up and say, well, we all just got to shoulder a bit because such and such is really struggling. My only advice is, back to the piece we made at the start about that team bonding and that team understanding piece, is helping people share what they are saying and how they're going about it. I have very, very recently decided to take some support around how I'm feeling and my own mental health, maybe caused by my previous career in the military. I don't really know. We're still working on that bit. But what's been really interesting is that every single time I have spoken to somebody about it and I have shared the fact that I am getting some support, just that statement of I'm getting some support has been a huge lift to the weight on my shoulders. So getting the team together to talk about how they're feeling might well help, Martin, and allowing people to say, this is how I'm feeling and I'm feeling really rubbish, because then that starts to generate more empathy from the individual who feels they're shouldering too much of the burden. And everybody starts to pull together a bit better. I hope that's helped answer the question a little bit. I'm conscious we need to push on because we've got about 22 minutes left and I've still got 3 factors to get through. So let's look first of all at trust. Okay, let's look at trust. So this is trust within the team and building up the areas within the team. Okay, so there's a really great article that came out literally this month from McKinsey. It's up on the screen there, and the link to it will be in the email that comes out after this webinar. But within it, I just picked out this one quote that I really liked about the fact that you cannot, in a crisis management situation, be in a command and control type of leadership or approach. You cannot wait to cascade things down through an organization the same way as you always have. You have to become much more agile. You have to become much more fluid. And that means that people in the organization need to get more and more empowered. There's a fantastic book written called Turn the Ship Around by a chap called David Marquet, who's a former US Navy submarine commander. And he talks about the fact that, initially he thought it was all about command and control. It wasn't until he started to trust the people that are working for him to make their own decisions and to give them the power to do that, that he saw how much more effective his organization became. And he called it pushing the authority to the information, not dragging the information to the authority. And that's a very powerful tool to consider. But that's still a bit conceptual, right? So how do we actually then start to make that happen? Well, there's a technique called freedom in a framework I'm just going to touch on now, okay? And I think any of you who are Matthew Said fans, his latest book, Rebel Ideas, is really good on this particular area. So if we imagine that we've already come up with our intent, right? We've written our 100-word précis. We've got people pointing in the right direction. What we now need are people to start to come up with ideas, to come up with plans and to come up with solutions. We need to give them a degree of latitude to make their own decisions. But if we allow them just to make their own decisions willy-nilly, then anything could happen and we could end up with chaos. Hence this term, freedom in a framework. So you define the framework. Here it's shown by a couple of rectangles. You can have whatever shape you want. It doesn't have to be even-sided. It can have 3 sides, 5 sides, whatever you want. But each side represents a parameter. So it could be the amount of budget you're willing to spend. It could be the amount of risk you're willing to take. It could be the number of people you're prepared to spare to work on this particular topic from your organization. It could be how willing you are to work with other external agencies and partner other external agencies or draw in their ideas or not. Whatever it is, you build some sort of framework. And as long as the team are inside that framework, they have the freedom to come up with the ideas as to how they're going to operate. And this really speeds up your effectiveness and your decision making, because now you've got whole teams within some parameters that you have defined, so therefore you own the risk, working out what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And if they feel they've got the delegated authority to make the next decision, they just make it and they move on. But you have controlled that risk by the size of the parameters, and you can increase the parameters or decrease them according to the situation. But just referencing back to Matthew Said's book, I want you to also think about the people inside each of those teams. The top rectangle that's shown there represents an organization that classically is only using their senior leadership team at this point in time. So we will always tend to recruit people to our organization that we like. We will tend to recruit people to our organization that we think will fit with everybody else in the organization. So therefore we end up with very similar people. As then through the course of their career they get promoted to very similar standards and requirements. So they become even more similar, to the point at which actually in the top diagram, essentially we have got 7 people, but they're all thinking exactly the same. They don't have enough diversity in their thinking. That's not demographic diversity, that's diversity of thought. In the bottom one, we've got more of a vertical slice, a spread of the organization, or maybe we've even brought in suppliers or clients, or if we're in a school, parents, to be involved in this discussion, in this debate. It'll really help us understand where we want to go and what we might do. And you're getting in a much wider sense of innovation and creativity coming in. So that is a way in which you can actually enable that network of teams and pushing out that decision making without losing overall control. I'll have a very quick look at a couple more questions. The psychological health and well-being, physical well-being of leaders during times of crisis is important. What can I offer? Ian? Yeah, absolutely. So I think, trying to make sure that you get exercise is a key thing. You'd expect that from a former Royal Marine, right? But trying to get exercise, it is a huge benefit to you. And seeing Joe Wicks doing his fantastic work every morning at 9 o'clock, for those of you who've got younger kids, getting people up, getting people active, you can get up and do that with the kids as well. That physical activity is really, really important. And you can do that even if you're living in a really small apartment somewhere and you can't actually physically get out onto the street. So there's that side of things. The mental well-being side of things, yes, is really important. And for that, I think it is a combination of lots of different factors. Taking the time to pause and reflect, which seems odd in a crisis management situation, but taking that time, I think, is really, really important. Also sharing things with other people. And sharing, the idea of, going through what you're doing, whether that's on a FaceTime call or anything else like that. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I genuinely hope that the environment we are now in and the environment that we are part of because of the coronavirus, the way in which we're reacting to that sticks, and sticks for a good long time. Because seeing people wanting to try and help others, seeing people wanting to make a difference, to go out and deliver things for elderly or vulnerable people, talking to each other more. All of a sudden, I'm on a WhatsApp group with my brother and my sister, which didn't exist before, and it's called Sibling Chit Chat. And it's just a check-in and how are you? I've had 4 or 5 messages this week from people I haven't spoken to for a long, long time, just saying, how are you? I imagine, it's quite difficult at the moment in a business that you're in. That really warms me, and I then respond, and then they get the warmth back from that response. So I think that is as much part of the mental well-being as anything else as a leader. Bench strength and reserve substitutes, Richard, to sustain team effort in a crisis, not just relying on the all-stars. Yeah. Absolutely, we've got to think about the long game with these sorts of things. We've got to think very carefully about the fact that when you're in a crisis, we will, if we're not careful, tend to go at it hammer and tongs and really nail it and give it our absolute max. And everybody is going at it full tilt for the first 2-3 days. And then it becomes weeks. And then, oh, really? We're into a month. So it becomes incredibly challenging and hard. And we run out of steam. I wouldn't necessarily talk about the all-stars and the bench or the fast finishers, whatever analogy you want to use from Eddie Jones and his rugby and everything else like that. I just think of it more in terms of everybody sharing an equal amount as much as they can. My wife works in a school. The school is staying open because they have children of key workers in there. We live in a very rural area, so we don't just have, you know, key workers from the health industry. We have a lot of the rural farming community who are absolutely needed right now to continue to produce goods and food for us. So that school is staying open. But what the headmistress has done is produce more of a rota and change shifts down because they aren't doing as much teaching. So people are getting time in and time out as you rotate through. And I personally, Richard, would try and get a blend of, if you do have all-stars as well as more of, you know, the bench people mixed together into a single team. Because A, they're going to learn from each other, B, they're going to support one another much more, and it will just be a better dynamic than a really high-powered team and then not a really high-powered team. I hope that's helped answer your question. Thank you very much for all the comments that are also coming through on the chats, saying, you know, that constraints are gifts, and love the idea of catching calm. Thank you, Thor. That's a lovely point, and I hope you're enjoying sharing and chatting on there. By all means, you can carry on chatting to each other as much as just to me. So let's get into the last couple of bits, and then I'll take the sort of final questions. First of all, on planning. There are lots and lots of different ways to plan, okay? Lots of different ways to plan. I'm not going to go into all of them because we just can't today. If you want to learn more about different planning techniques, different concepts, I'll very happily do another webinar for you all where we just look at planning, if you like. By all means, ask that if you want to, or I can do it one-to-one if you've got specific questions. But the principles, again, behind this are essentially about keeping things very simple, keeping it accessible, particularly in a situation we're in now. If you have people at home and working from home, but they still need to react to something, you need a plan that they can access from anywhere. And therefore, the technology side of things and the adaptability of technology really starts to play in here. So there's lots of different technologies out there that you can use for this, like Asana or Trello. Personally, I really like one called Method Grid, which is the picture you can see up on the screen as well here. I like Method Grid because it's cloud-based. I know the others are as well. And therefore, any changes or adaptations that I make to my plan, they're instantly replicated for everybody. So you don't end up with version this or version that coming out on emails and people getting confused about which version they're meant to be doing. It's just still the plan. So the technology really helps us there. I personally like the fact it's a picture. I can see in the different swim lanes who needs to do what and by when as we go through the different chronological vertical columns. What I particularly like, though, about Method Grid is that if I was to click on any one of these different colored little elements within the table, they pop out, and inside them you can have a video that tells people what to do. So it could be, here's how to turn off this particular valve. Here is the access code that you go through. Here's the door that you do it. Here's where you can actually walk through recording a video and then hang that video into that element so somebody can actually watch it and follow it for real. You can put checklists in there, so tick boxes, so people make sure they haven't missed anything. You can put guidance in there. You can hang a document in there from your document library so that people can see and check up on any of the policies that they needed to. So that's my particular favorite. But the point here is, have something that's simple, easy to reference, easy to update, and accessible from anywhere. How do we go about producing a plan? It's really tricky because there's lots of different ways, but I've tried to boil it down to some basic principles, and based on a military planning technique that we used to use a lot, and that was brought about by the military to cope with very, very sharp end situations, otherwise known as an ambush. Okay, so we start off with situational awareness. What is happening right now, and how is that affecting me? That's really important. And how is it affecting us? So if we take the current situation that we're in, okay, it might be that it's affecting me personally in a certain way. I'm feeling a certain way about the situation, but it's also affecting my team in a certain way, and it's also affecting my business in a certain way. So already now I have 3 different things that I've got to start to think about, that I've identified from the situation, and how is it affecting me or us, just by asking that question, affecting me or us. Okay. Based on those situations, now I go to the objectives. What is it that I want to achieve? Where do I want to be personally? Where do I want the business to end up being? Where do I want the team to get to? So that now sets those objectives, and they're smart objectives that I know I can deliver because I've actually got them as something measurable. Once I've got those objectives, then comes a bit that I promise you're all going to hate me for, but actually is really important, which is choices and options. Okay. The obvious thing that we jump to once we've worked out what the situation is and what we're going to achieve is, here's the plan, because it's obvious what we're going to do, right? It's staring us right in the face. But that doesn't always help. We've got to think about other ways in which we can try and achieve those objectives. We've got to think about other pathways. So if I take you again briefly back to Afghanistan and to Helmand, at one point we had an area that we needed to deal with, right? It was full of our opponent. And so the obvious military solution is, well, you just bomb the heck out of it, right? Because that's then dealt with it. Well, yes, it has, but you've also destroyed a whole bunch of people and their livelihoods that were completely innocent. But at the same time that we were there, the price of wheat seed was through the roof because of a collapse of the crop in both Russia and in Canada. So could we distribute wheat seed and get the tribal elders to help get those people, our opponents, out of that area? Because the tribal elders are very powerful. Yeah, well, maybe we could. And maybe that then is an entirely different way to achieve our same aims. So I want you to think about how to develop different options, different choices as you're running things through, before you then come to the resources you might need to do your chosen one, because you'll never end up choosing just A or B. It's nearly always a little bit of A and a little bit of B. Okay. And once you've come up with those resources, synchronizing what's going to happen when, and some sort of timeline or Gantt chart or plan, whatever it is, before you then also put in place some controls. How do you stop yourself getting distracted by shiny things as you start to try and deliver the plan? Keep yourself on those train tracks. Okay, what I'm going to do, just conscious of time, I've got 5 minutes left, is talk very briefly about the testing side of things. And then I'll answer any final questions that have popped up as we've been going along, okay? Once we have got a plan, so we've communicated to the team with intent what we want to happen. We've trusted the team by giving them a framework to operate within. They've come up with some plans using perhaps the methodology I've just spoken about. What we don't do at this stage is just run the plan and hope it works, okay? What we do is we test the plan before we launch it. And there's a couple of different ways to do that. There's lots of ones that I've got here up on the screen, like De Bono's 6 Thinking Hats. And again, I've got a reference to that and that will come through with your closing email, right? But the 2 I'll just touch on very briefly here are red team, blue team, and pre-mortem, okay? So in a red team, blue team approach, you get a blue team who champion the plan. So whatever plan you've come up with as to how you're going to deal with this crisis, 2 or 3 people, or even 1 person if you're in a really small organization, says this is the plan and this is what we're doing. And you imagine that you are enacting the plan for real, as if you're starting at day 0 and starting to move it forward. and you produce a panel to challenge you and to critique those ideas positively as well as negatively. Okay, and that panel is formed of all of the different people who you'll think will be affected by the plan. So it could be they're your clients, it could be your suppliers, it could be competitors, which you'll role play. You won't have them in there for real, but you could have real suppliers, you could have real clients, you could have real parents, or from the club or the school or the church that you belong to. Okay, then you've got people from inside your organization, and the blue team essentially say, this is what we are doing, and the red team react to it. And a control team capture the outputs in terms of the actions you need to take to improve the plan, things that you missed, gaps that you hadn't previously identified, risks that you hadn't previously identified, etc. And you just go around the circle from red team to blue team, red team to blue team, acting and reacting as you go along. Now, that is a real quick skip across that one. Okay, so I'm very conscious there may be some questions around it, and potentially it could be the subject of another future webinar where we go into it in a bit more depth. The other one is a pre-mortem, and it is exactly what it says on the tin. This, instead of starting at day 0 of your plan and imagining it rolling out over time, this goes right to the end of the plan and imagines it's been a total catastrophe and a failure. You then identify reasons why that will have happened. You then rank and prioritize those reasons for failure. So you've got the real big risks and big problems at the top and the little niff-naff at the bottom. And you then very quickly start to flick that to, how can I mitigate against those? How can I protect myself against those? So this is a way of doing worst case scenario testing. And the red team, blue team is more of the realistic testing, if you like, but two very useful tests. Okay. Let's come back to this point here now, and we'll jump on some questions for the last couple of minutes, and I will try and get through as many of them as I can for you. Okay. Ben, a small team of employees. If you're looking at the possibility of making redundancies, how do you manage the realistic fear for others when all working remotely? Yeah, that is a real challenge, Ben, because, obviously as human beings, we rely on human interaction. And therefore, even if we're on something like this type of webinar or a chat, where we can all see each other's faces, it's very difficult to actually manage those emotions. Maybe within the chat, people will have better answers than me on that, but to be honest, I don't really know, other than trying to do your best to do it virtually until such time as you can get people together. But I would suggest that it's still worthwhile talking about that thorny issue, because if you don't, it's all everyone's going to be thinking about and getting anxious about. Sorry, Ben, that's probably a really poor answer to that one. Alberto, I'm a scientist, so I need a full detailed picture before deciding. How do you make a decision in a time-consistent manner? Yeah, unfortunately, Alberto, I'm afraid you are going to have to learn that sometimes 80% is much better than waiting for 100% and being too late, okay? If you take the quick example of the conflict in the Second World War, of the German forces coming down through Belgium, France, and the Low Countries, they were using a system that I've described already to you this afternoon, of that freedom in a framework and intent, so they were able to make decisions and move straight on. The French and British forces were using command and control and doing analysis of absolutely everything, so they're 100% sure of what was going on. They were coming up with brilliant solutions as to how to stop the advance of the German forces, but it was always too late because the German forces have already gone past, because they're using the intent and freedom in a framework. So that is something where you personally, Alberto, I'm very sorry, are going to have to get a bit more comfortable with feeling uncertain about the amount of information that you've got. Okay, just keeping through some of the other ones. Technology divide, yeah, I mean, Microsoft Teams and things like that, what's the best type of technology to use? I'll be very honest, Daniel, I am not a technology expert, and so therefore it's probably best that I don't really get stuck into that too much. Okay, it is really one of those things where you're probably better off seeking somebody, and I'm sure there might be other people on this webinar that are still here we could chat. I mean, we've still got 70 participants on here now. Maybe somebody could offer up some ideas, or anything else like that for Daniel on the technology divide, because, you know, I'm not really one inexperienced enough in that sort of area. I tend to be somebody who either just uses Zoom or whatever system my client has told me to use. Apologies about that. Okay, I am conscious that it's now 1 minute past 5, and being a military person, it's going to make me really anxious if I don't finish, you know, particularly well. We've got a question, a couple in here. So Google Hangouts is simple to use and very functional. That's come from Craig. Zoom is great for team meetings. That's come from Edwina. So if you have a look, Daniel, within the chat function, there's lots of people suggesting different types of functionalities that could be used. Okay, so just going back to see the last couple of questions. Some thoughts on how to maintain personal energy levels during this crisis. A lot of it, Nick, is about rest. A lot of it is about understanding that you do need to rest. When I was in the Royal Marines, I got really, really good at napping. And if I got the chance for literally a 5-10 minute nap, then I would take it, and I would absolutely take it. So understanding that you need rest, that you need to take downtime is really important to help maintain that personal energy. Getting a break from the situation that you're facing. I've obviously been anxious. It's normal to be anxious about giving this webinar, and I'm hoping it's going well. I've been trying to rehearse it. But today I took a very deliberate pause to actually go and just take some time outside in the garden, take a wander around the garden, get some fresh air, have a look at what was going on, just purely to get a break before I came back in ready to try and deliver it. So again, it's about that sort of buffer zone, I think, essentially. Martin Flick has very kindly said that he's happy to give free consultancy on technology to anybody who needs it. And Martin's email is Martin, spelled MARTIN, .flick, FLICK, at olive.co.uk. That's martin.flick at olive.co.uk. Martin, thank you very much for offering up that advice. That's really kind and helpful. Thank you. And I see you've put that into the chat function as well for people. Right, okay, I'm sure everybody's got to go now, and I've certainly got to go, but just from me to everybody else, thanks for your attention this afternoon. If you do want to explore anything in any more detail, please do get in touch. If you've got suggestions as what you'd like to go into in more detail in a future webinar, I'm very happy to set that up and do another webinar for people. Good luck, stay safe, look after one another, and look after yourselves, because in looking after yourselves, you'll be able to look after other people. Okay, so thank you very much indeed. Take care, and bye-bye.